Welcome to our first interview of the Discovery Files. In this episode, Scott Briscoe and Ahmad Salim are going to interview Ayesha Ahmed about her experience in the discovery of Invincible at St. Ives. Ayesha has 15 years' experience in a variety of roles with several large companies. She received her master's degree from the University of British Columbia in geochemistry and then did a PhD with codes at the University of Tasmania. She recently left her role as manager of geoscience in the ore body knowledge group at Tech Resources and now is independently consulting. So I figure we'll start off, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just kind of describe your memory of this discovery and what stood out to you at the time, and maybe we can kind of move into what has struck you in the years since, and then in the panic of researching to come on this episode.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe I'll set the scene a little bit because this was, 15 years ago now, or about 14 years ago. And this working at St. Ives, so this is the St. Ives Gold Camp in Western Australia. We're in the outback. We're about 600 kilometers east of Perth, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And this was my first real job after school. So, in university, it's really common in Canada to have these 3 or 4 month kind of contracts. But this was the first permanent job. So my now husband and I, Sean, had been flown over from Canada and landed sight unseen in Kalgoorlie to work in Kambalda. And we were living in Kambalda, a small town outside of Kalgoorlie, and doing the residential kind of drive-in, drive-out. So my role when I started there was as a what would you call it? A exploration geologist, maybe even a graduate geologist to start with. And it was really field-based. So a lot of working on the Salt Lake, following the Air Corps rig around, logging chips, working in the mud, getting a sunburn on the neck, on the back of your neck and your chin. But it was really incredible to get to know, the St. Ives camp, which is a world-renowned camp, and to be working on so many different projects. So I was working with one of the project geologists at the time, Nick Van Clavern, a man of a million ideas. If you can draw a line on a map to represent a fault, then he would do that. There were 100 lines on all of his maps. But he had this target. I think at the time it was called LT17. And so the name changed afterwards. And it was an analog of one of the deposits close by. I think it was the Santa Ana deposit, intrusion-related or tonalite-related, shear-related gold deposit. And so he thought, okay, we're going to target this underneath the Salt Lake. And that target actually might have been there before, Scott. Do you have memory of that? Was the LT site before Nick or after Nick?
It was before. It was LT17 South because they divided it into North and South. And if we can get Dale Sanderson on the show, he knows every historical fact about St. Ives that could be known. So he'll be the guy that knows if anybody does.
Okay, point being, there were some dots on a map that were gold hits, and our job was to infill that kind of pattern grid drilling with the Air Corps rig, and I was the geo on that rig. So it was kind of like a 6-month process of going through those drill programs, and we got the results back, and it was pretty clear that we had a coherent gold anomaly. I think it's worth describing as well, this is on the Salt Lake, Lake Lefroy Salt Lake, and many people have not worked in this kind of environment. And Goldfields was a real leader, I think, in exploring on the Salt Lake. There's this thin crust of salt, maybe 20 centimeters thick, and beneath that is just mud and junk. So, you're having to walk on this, your boots are getting stuck, drills are trying to make their way through the muck, and there's sometimes, a meter of water, sometimes there's no water. So it's pretty harsh environment to work in, and it's also blind. There's no evidence of the geology.
I think I was gonna say you should. I was gonna say you should really talk about like the Salt Lake part because No, not that you haven't, like you have, but I think it's important because like in the Salt Lake, I think you often have these kind of like old like gold hits, and then like people try to chase them with drilling, and then they can't drill them, so sometimes they get left behind, and then they kind of get forgotten and things like that. So one of the questions I had is LT17, like like what was the original source of the anomaly? Was it some like drilling that was done previously?
Yeah. So On this LT, I think is lake target. And so
Yeah,
17 is,
let's not kid ourselves. There's no imagination usually applied to the
there were
naming of these
obviously
anomalies, right?
16 targets before and probably
Yeah.
20 targets
Yeah.
afterwards. But yeah, they did kind of very, very far apart lines that went across some of the major structures in the area that were identified largely from airborne geophysics and magnetics, right? So you could tell which way the geology, the stratigraphy was striking, and a lot of the Air Corps lines were doing kind of regional drilling around that, targeting different structures and different analogs. So the historic anomalies were, hopefully they were actually what's it called, basement anomalies, because there was also paleochannel in the area. So really understanding your regolith and whether you're in transported material or in situ material are really important too.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, the reason why I wanted to say that is, like often with discoveries, it's was the Nick the
Yep.
interesting individual
Nick
that you started the
Finclaverin.
story
Yep.
with? Yeah. So I think it's often like these discovery stories are often where there is something that's unusual, a target that's like existing, unusual, something like that. And it often takes someone kind of it takes someone's curiosity kind of peak, and they go, like, well, why is this, like, why is LT this lake target in this location or versus this location, something like that. So I think it's interesting that, like, like just naturally your story starts off with the fact that there's some existing anomaly. It's in a hard to kind of reach place, which it explains why it might have been somewhat left behind or taken a while to kind of drill. So I think it's interesting that the story already kind of starts with this.
Yeah, and then there's that northern extension I think they drilled previously, which wasn't a northern extension, it was along the same shear. Was it Lute, I think is what it was called?
Lute.
Yeah, and I think that was the same structure, right? So it's like, so they'd kinda been investigating it over the last, like, 15 years before, right? But so what do you think changed here? Like, why do you think, I mean, because you were working with Nick, and I know you had some good conversations with him over that time.
Well, do you want the truth? I guess the truth is I think it was an accident. So I think there was this idea of it being an analog to something else. I think the idea of there being very key structures there was real, but the stratigraphy of the area, what Invincible turned out to be, is very, very different from what that analog was. So I think that following up on those older anomalies and those hits, Air Corps hits, was really important. Whoever brought Nick and the team into that area was important. But after that, I think that the geological understanding completely changed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
wow.
what was the first step in that? Like, so I guess, like, you drilled the Air Core, and then what comes next?
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth mentioning that most of the greenstone hosted Archean deposits were not hosted in the sedimentary rocks that Invincible is hosted in. So Invincible is hosted in these black flags, group, mudstones, sandstones, and most of the other deposits are hosted in dolerites and basalts of the intruding into the lower black flags. We kind of had to get over this barrier first of saying this is a worthy target because it's in a completely different stratigraphic unit. And I think there was one other deposit hosted on site, Bellerophon, which was in some of the sedimentary rocks, but the sediments were really seen as a non-target. So when we started hitting that in Air Core, even though we were getting these great results, there was a little bit of hesitation around, oh, we don't really have a great model for this or a great analog. Is this something worth pursuing? But I have to say, talking about what makes success, I think there was really good management backing. So yeah, we had Julian Woodcock and Malcolm Jolly. And what I really liked about Malcolm's management style was some free rein, to let the geos do what the geos were good at, focus on the technical work. And he went to bat for us, at the higher levels. I was very a low level back then, and I'm sure I missed a lot and was shielded from a lot. But what I saw was quite a lot of support and rapid turnaround on funding. So when we had that initial kind of coherent anomaly in the Air Core, we were rapidly able to follow it up with a number of diamond holes. I love that we went to diamond first, and that was really common at St. Ives. It wasn't, RC was used more for infill. So we went straight away to diamond. I think it was like a 7 or 8 hole program. about 4 or 5 of them hit along this main structure, main shear, and it formed this coherent mineralized structure of about 2 kilometers strike length. And I think at that point, it was really clear that, okay, you know, there's a lot we need to figure out here, but we can see that the holes that didn't hit, they're in the hanging wall. That's barren. This Black Flag's mudstone is clearly the host, and we have this coherent structure along 2 kilometers. And from there, it went bananas. Just absolutely bananas. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you make, right? Because I've worked at a lot of companies that wouldn't have taken that leap of faith, right? And Julian backed that, and Malcolm backed that, and I know it's always at the time there. I had a lot of tension, I think, with my management team and things like that. But they were great about that. That's super rare, right? And so yeah, like you go back to like all the little odd things that have to happen to make an exploration discovery. And that's the biggest one is trust from your management, right? So it's like you can't give those guys enough of a shout out for what they did, right?
Yeah. I also know you, I think, presented once on the number of drill holes it takes to find a deposit, you know, and I think I've had this follow-up conversation with so many people. And one of the challenges with exploration these days, of course, because everything's expensive, is not testing targets adequately, you know, popping 1 or 2 drill holes in and then walking away from that. And I really feel like with the kind of 7 or 8 drill holes that we had at Invincible, we gave it a really good chance, testing a lot of different ways that the anomaly, the data could fit the anomaly and the kind of different models that might explain that data. So I think that was a real lesson to me is don't bother with these piddly 2-hole programs, you know, go in and give it your best effort.
I mean, because right before this, you'd been working on, I forgot the name of it, but it was on the same shear zone to the south.
Oh,
And
incredible. Yeah.
yeah. It's like we had an eye thing going at the time, right? Yeah, the Battle of Trafalgar. So it was really cool. I think they had a thing, it was like the ship, the British were the ones on the Salt Lake, and then the Spanish and French were the ones on the land, something like that.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
There was a
Oh, wow.
map in one of the Geo's office had a map of the Battle of Trafalgar. So that's how I learned this, because he explained it all to me. So,
nice.
but so that deposit, like it was kind of an interesting thing because there was some really great, you know, hits in it, and like I think some things actually in some ways looked even more promising than
Yes.
Invincible did, but it didn't hold together, right? So and to me that was really interesting. It's like because I think they had even more drill holes in Incredible, and it just didn't work, right? Like if you can't build a resource estimate, you can't move it to the next stage. And that was our whole goal in that team, was to try and advance things to that next stage so that, you know, the people who are good at drilling them out can do their job, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And it's, you know, that entire trend of Black Flags, you know, became a target after, well, you know, I think it had been a target, but it was more of a target after finding Invincible. But there was really this sweet spot in, I think, the localization of strain, how thick the Black Flags mudstone was in that particular area, because yeah, at Incredible, there were all of these just individual veins form one shear, you know, or like one structure that could be modeled. So really interesting to see where money is funneled into and how those decisions are made, where to go and where not. Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's another real challenge of management that, you know, like you think about like Julian and Malcolm, they would have had to have some serious conversations with their bosses on that, right? And yeah, so I guess like you talked about the importance of diamond drilling on this. So what was kind of key for you in that, and why that led to like success?
Well, number one, I mean, it's a gold deposit. So I think it's pretty common. Everything's oriented. So it was oriented core. And that was, of course, really important to understand, you know, the dip of stratigraphy, the relationship of the shear veins and structures to stratigraphy, looking at the intersection of foliations and shear zones to look at plunge. In the footwall of the deposit, there were these two very different styles of mineralization. Had these thin veins, extensional veins in the footwall, and to get those orientations and be able to model them. So that was really important. Being able to put the visual observations together with structural data was very, very important. And then also to be able to get multi-element geochemistry, to distinguish between different rock units, to look at alteration halos around the deposit, to better understand what we're seeing in air core versus what we're seeing in the diamond, and being able to extrapolate that back to other programs that are at earlier stages. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I kind of get out of it is like you made the point about how you sometimes have to invest like early in programs and drill. Like, yeah, I mean, when it comes to, I think, exploration, you just have to accept that at some point you have to invest in drilling. Like you mentioned that Invincible was like a model you guys didn't quite have as like the archetyped ore body you were looking for. And so can you comment a little bit? I guess my interpretation would be is that the fact that you invested in going with a method that reduced the early uncertainty that you had, which was to diamond drill, like that kind of allows you to understand like the new model better, understand like the setting. Like if you had just stuck with air core, maybe you wouldn't have gotten that as quickly as you could have. Can you comment on that? Like, do you think that's the case in there?
Sure. And I should just be, very transparent that the decision to drill diamond was not mine. And I think it's one that was more just historically, that is what was done on site, was to drill diamond. And part of that was logistics. So like, St. Ives was very much a camp and a brownfields exploration camp located very close to town. And we had drillers and drilling companies, on call to have a rig available within 24 hours. And because we had so many different targets at St. Ives, there was always kind of, a rig going that if we had something higher priority could be remobilized. So I do think it's really important to distinguish between a really greenfields target in the middle of nowhere and the kind of discovery that was made,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Having said that, I think there's a point at which air core can no longer help you, right? So I think air core will give you very much like soil sampling. It's the soil sampling of Australia, like regolith, the deeper regolith terrains, right?
Yeah.
So it's really good as an initial test, but you really can't build a resource, basement resource from that. So you pretty quickly have to go to RC or diamond. And I think that there had been established challenges with RC as well. With gold, nuggety gold, you can get all sorts of biases. So I feel like in structural...
Also drilling on a lake with RC, is not always the easiest option.
Yeah, I think I remember like the drill contractor saying that they didn't have any tracks wide enough to support an RC rig. And so I was kind of thinking about that as like, it's like a lot of serendipity, like to be like, oh, this is what we're drilling. There's no argument about it. And it's like, and it led to this being successful, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, you went from the, initial discovery to like inferred resource, and like, how much time was it again?
I think it was about a year and a bit. It was all hands on deck. Certainly not it was a very much a team effort, of multiple people logging, really the assay labs doing really quick priority turnarounds, and, multiple rigs on the project after that kind of initial discovery. So yeah, it was but it was also very well behaved, I have to say. So, it was constrained to one stratigraphic unit, a long strike. Yes, there was a lot of structural complexity, but quite easy to pattern drill out once the initial discovery was found.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'd heard a great quote recently where it was good geology work gets you into the target area and luck determines how much gold is there. And I was thinking about that I think good geology work got you into the target area of incredible as well. But the luck was that it didn't hold together, right? So I think that was one of the best, amounts of gold you found in that shear zone, but it just doesn't hold together, right? So it was bad luck, right? And so I don't know, like I don't want to throw too much bias into the show, but I've been kind of shocked throughout my career of how much of a part luck has in discovery, and it's but you can't do without good science too. So it's a really interesting mix, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also we were talking about this before, Scott, that one of the really interesting parts of being able to see now, I wasn't part of St. Ives at the time, but when they actually dug the open pit and they went underground, and you can see that the initial concepts that we had of a kind of 3D geology diagram that we worked on with Steve Cox as well, was like really well known in the industry, held up really well. 10 years later, they're underground and they're seeing very much the same kind of thing. So I think the geoscience also plays a really important part in de-risking the operation, right? Because the discovery is great, but
Hmm.
to make it economic and to keep it economic, you need to have that geoscience there.
Yeah.
Also, one small comment. I really don't want to take credit for Incredible. I was
Yeah.
there as the young geo and designed some holes, but I also think Nick played a really important
Yeah.
part in that target
Yes,
generation.
I suppose the problem of the language of you is you
Yeah,
all, right?
that's
So
all. I
it's
just to clarify.
and I
Yeah.
think that's the key sometimes, right? Is having a good team of people that work well together. So it's if you can't communicate well with the people you're working with, it doesn't lend strength. So it's I guess like how was your experience working with Nick? Because that must have been really wild to be like, you come over from Canada and like straight to Australia and all of that holds. And then here you are in the middle of nowhere working in like mud and salt and everything else. So a lot of complications there. And then also you're working with one person for a long period of time, right? So what was that like?
Yeah. I mean, I learned a lot from him. I knew absolutely nothing about regolith before, moving to Australia, regolith development, and he was an amazing teacher. Really interestingly, and kind of his misfortune, but he was seconded to, I think it was Finland,
Yeah.
very soon after we got approval to drill that program at Invincible. So I worked with him for quite a while, and then he went away and we drilled and we had all of this success, largely to do with him. And he came back to it, I think it was 6 months or maybe even a year afterwards.
Yeah.
So I imagine very, difficult to come back to that situation, and exciting as well to have seen it advanced. But yeah, I learned a lot from him.
Yeah, man. And I mean,
I
the other
guess
thing the other thing I was going to say is I can kind of get out of this is, you guys talked about geology and the operational side as well. And I feel like, it seemed like, like Scott, you and I talk about this, right? That like often discovery needs a lot of these kind of widgets to fall into place. So like, from a geological point of view or from a technical point of view, the group was, like, I don't know if it's the right word, like mature enough that they were open to new ideas or they would be willing to chase new ideas. Operationally, like the group was mature enough that they could, like carry out a drill out really quickly. Because often, like that's a problem when people have to scale. Like if you spent like, last 10 years using one drill rig and all of a sudden you have to use a 5 or 10, that causes enormous amounts of issue inside a company as well. So, so there's all like, if, like the moment that Invincible came into your group at that time and you happened to be there for that time, it was also a time where I think the group had gotten to a point where they were probably in the right space to actually exercise, a new type of deposit and be able to execute on it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I would say one thing that I noted, when I was kind of preparing for this and thinking back on the experience was how researchers were always part of the experience in the project generation group. And I
Hmm.
feel that brought, and that was the case in the past, I know, where when WMC was at St. Ives, was this link between kind of academia and industry that isn't part of a lot of companies. So, we were always having people like Ray Cass and Pat Heyman from University of Melbourne come and talk to us about the stratigraphy. So we really
Hmm.
understood how everything, was put in place. Steve Cox talking to us about seismic pumping and structural models, and it was just so important to keep that kind of mentality so that you're not hyper focused into, okay, it can only be dolerites that host these kind of deposits. It's actually all these different ingredients, and those exist in the mudstones as much as the dolerites. So it allowed and supported that open mind.
That's a good
I
point.
remember on that note, like I remember Ed Baltus came out and he was like
Oh,
the
at
chief
Baltic.
geo for
Yeah.
Goldfields and I remember like being so crestfallen because he asked such a good question that I hadn't ever thought to ask at the time. I've made sure to not make the same mistake. But he asked, okay, so everybody write up on the whiteboard what all the key ingredients are for a successful exploration project. And so everybody kind of wrote their ideas and things like that. And so, like we're looking for extensional jogs and we're looking for, these things. And then he goes, okay, now I want someone else to write up the top 10 mines on the camp and talk about which one of these features belong to which of these mines. And it was like half of the mines were compressional jogs. And I was like, and I just remember being like, I have failed as a geologist. But it was that idea, right? As he came there to open minds, to say, stop getting stuck in a rut and think outside the box. And so I think that was very much part of that culture, right? It was like this, it was the St. Ives School of Mines, right? You go there to learn, not just to work.
Yeah. And I have to say, too, I mean, somewhat not related to the discovery part, but having worked there for, I think it was about 4 years after the discovery, I was lucky enough to be part of the geological modeling, all of the core logging, the looking at the multi-element geochemical modeling, drill hole planning, even working with the metallurgists and doing acid rock drainage type stuff, some resource estimation. And that I have never had that kind of experience at another company where you get to do all of that. Of course, there's somebody else more experienced reviewing all of that and supporting and doing the final resource model. But it really helped me to understand what makes a deposit economic. What are the factors that can modify a deposit to remove value or add value? And that was a pretty incredible experience.
Yeah.
So
Man.
I guess imagine this was probably quite the whirlwind, right? Like, so you go from a relatively junior geo to, drilling out what becomes a major discovery, and then you're getting involved in all these different things. So what were your feelings at this time? Like, I mean, were you excited or were you stressed or what was it like?
Little bit of A, a little bit of B. I remember in 2012, we finished one drill out and I was on my way to the airport to get married. And I got a call from Julian with the latest intercepts and they were just phenomenal. And, that was like the highest high. But then on the flip side, you're given all this opportunity to learn, for example, how to do resource models. And I remember staying really late and trying to snap these very individual vein wireframes, in data mine to one another, and super stressed out because, of course, like it's make or break how many ounces come out of this. So, of course, yeah, I think it's both, but by far the most exciting time in my career, I would say.
And one of the things, like someone once mentioned to me, it's like, they said it was a good thing that they were in the discovery process, is that they weren't too high up, because not having that responsibility was actually a good thing, right? Because they go, like, man, my job was to just drill holes and, like you said, wireframe things. The matzo ball was all in someone else's court about how to figure out how to sell it to management and do all of that stuff. And they were like, yeah. I remember asking someone this, and they were like, oh, yeah, it wasn't stressful. He's like, it wasn't my job to make the decision. Yeah, I just did the work. So it's always, you gotta kind of accept that actually, like you were at a point now where, for better or for worse, you didn't actually see kind of the challenges that like management would have faced in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
where you were just kind of about the work and nothing else really at that time.
Very much so. Although I have to say, I think that there was very little bad about Invincible. And I would love to hear from somebody like maybe Malcolm, whether that's an incorrect perception. But I think it was from the get-go, and because it moved so quickly, a pretty positive experience. Like there weren't a lot of times along the way where it was thought, oh, this isn't going to make it, But maybe Scott, you have that insight.
I don't know. I think I felt that Julian always asked good questions, and I guess he was hard to please because he expected you to answer with facts, and you had to. I remember like all of the forms, like that we had, like to try and formalize the exploration process, and like trying to, because I think Dale Sanderson, I think he's the one that after Gustav Norkia had done the initial diamond sign off and gotten Julian and Malcolm to sign it. But I think then it was Dale, and then later I think I got involved in that. But I just remember he wanted to know that you actually were thinking about it. And so at the time I remember being frustrated, and there's a lot of stuff going on. But I always remember that it was more, do you actually have a geological clue of what's happening, or are you
Yeah.
guessing? And so it was a lot of going back and forth to people and being like, hey, no, we need to make a better diagram that actually explains this. But with that said, it then also documented that process. So I'm sure somewhere at the site, there's all those documents that, have everybody's signatures on them and
Hmm.
have all the description. So I guess it was stressful, but it was also achievable, if that makes sense. So I remember being more excited than stressed. I remember being
Yeah.
more looking forward to the next results, and a lot of because also Julian made the call to involve a ton of different departments really early on,
Yeah.
and I think Malcolm supported him in that. But so we ended up getting environmental involved and all these
Yep.
other groups. And then they started working on permitting that causeway out so that they could do the RC drill out. And I think all those things, like, I don't know, I felt like maybe in hindsight, I think Julian took a lot of personal risk making that happen. But I think he had the vision to see that it was something different. And
Yeah.
so, yeah. So at the time, I remember I was probably a terrible employee because that's how I feel most of the time I am. But yeah, I just remember being excited and then a little bit stressed, but just really excited, and I wonder how he feels. So I'm hoping to get him on the show too, because I think it'd be really interesting to hear his opinion of this as well. So and
Definitely.
Malcolm as well.
I mean, one of the things that I think of is like, like how easy it could have been to kill this thing along the way, right? Ed showed up and went, this is not the model. We've got, we've got 19 deposits in the bag. None of them look like this. You guys are
Yeah.
wasting time. Go, like move on somewhere else. Julian, Malcolm, like somewhere in the hierarchy, someone, up could have gone, yeah, you guys are distracted or like unfocused on something, and it could have kind of died along the way. I think just as easily. I think, and yeah, that's my perception. Do you guys think that could have been true?
I think so. I've thought about subsequent companies I've worked for. I think the first three drill holes were dusters. They were too far in the hanging wall, if I remember right. And I think they were. I don't even know if they were altered. Like in hindsight. And I've worked for companies that saw that and went, "Can the program? It's done." And I look at that and I know Julian was looking at those holes. I know he was. And so I think it goes back to what you said. Like I think Malcolm had put a lot of trust and autonomy in people, and it couldn't have been easy for him because like they're chewing through money drilling on a diamond, like diamond holes on a salt lake, right? And so I can't imagine that was easy. I imagine they very much had the temptation to cut it short with those first few holes looking as bad as they did. What's your thoughts, Ayesha?
It's interesting because I don't remember the holes being contingent on one another. And I think in this case, that was actually important because the holes were
Mm.
testing many different hypotheses. So if they had all been testing the one model, the one stratigraphic unit, and the first three were dusters, I could see them shutting it down. But we didn't get all the results back, until like kind of all at once. And hole A wasn't, or hole G wasn't contingent on hole A. So I think that I would have been really surprised if they had walked away from those 4 or 5 holes that showed continuous strike. I mean, I hadn't seen anything like that in my
Hmm.
time at St. Ives, and in the 4 subsequent years, I didn't see anything, that good. Yeah, I mean, based on those first 3 holes, of course, I could see them walking away. But because they were all drilled together in a very short period of time, the turnaround time for the assays was pretty quick. You could look at it as a whole project instead of part A
Yeah.
and
Okay.
part B.
And I think that's been actually a key learning for me is articulating that concept is incredibly important to say these holes should not be dependent on each other. The success of these three should not impact whether those four get drilled. But unfortunately, that's been the reality I've seen almost everywhere else I've worked is the perception of a program ignored the reality of the individual drill holes. And so I don't know. That's like I think about that's a cultural thing that worked really, really well at St. Ives, but I've not seen it everywhere. And I think that's key to the success there. So it's like stick with the concept, right? Like these holes are testing different ideas. Make it happen, see it out, right?
And I think that, again, coming back to the fact that it was brownfields kind of exploration and we had all the benefits of being, in a city and close to power and everything, there's a little bit more wiggle room. I think, in general, the cost of drilling was was low. So you're not flying in to the side of a mountain where every single half meter matters, right? The cost
Yeah,
is
yeah,
a
you're
lot.
already drilling a lot. So, like, like if you drill 50 holes in a year, if you scratch two, it's not really that big an issue. Whereas if you're only drilling five and you scratch two, that's a much
Yeah.
bigger problem. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that the way I think the way you kind of described the environment that you were in and how that allowed you to kind of pursue these initial kind of results, which like as they were good, but you talked about the other deposit, Incredible. You're saying you got some
Yeah.
great results out of there, but then but the follow up kind of to some degree failed because it didn't hang together. Even I think just those kind of lessons that the group had already had in that things can look good, they still take time to figure out. They may or may not turn out good. I think like all of that kind of like builds up to like Invincible coming at the right time and kind of I think that group's evolution as well. It seems like to me, anyways.
Yeah, definitely. And with Incredible, there was no easy geological model to explain why the gold was where it was, why each individual little vein and hit was where it was. Whereas with Invincible, it was so visual and so clear what was controlling it that I think it was a lot easier to sell as well.
Yeah, and I think that's often a challenge, right? In that, like trying to articulate the early uncertainty that you have about a deposit. I mean, one of the things that I feel is there's this kind of dogma, right? That as soon as you start drilling out a deposit, you kind of know the deposit or you know lots of things about it. But that's not always the case, right? It's only after it's like sometimes you get to resource drilling stage and you go, now actually I can kind of explain the two or three key things about this deposit. But the rest of the time, every hole that you drill, you're thinking that it's gonna back up what results you got in the last one. Like that hole can either increase the uncertainty or just do nothing to the level of uncertainty you already have. So I think that's
Yeah.
also a dogma about like that you always know everything about these things. I think it's often like a lot later on in the tape that you kind of learn everything that you need to know about them.
So Aisha, what's some of the biggest lessons you took from this that changed the rest of your career trajectory?
Wow. Okay. Big question. Let's see. I think the two biggest ones, which we talked about at the beginning, just kind of area selection and what area you are considering as permissible. So in this case, the Salt Lake, which had been not completely, but mostly ignored for, the 100 years previous because of how difficult it was to explore on it, now became, open and permissible for exploration, really looking for that leverage as to where you can go that you haven't been able to go before. So that worked in our favor. The other, of course, was not to always believe the models. So, think outside of the box. And why wouldn't the Black Flags mudstone of the same age as the Dolerites or slightly older, why wouldn't they be a good host? Why have they been ignored? So when you look at the combination of a different stratigraphic unit on the Salt Lake, like the amount of area that opened up for exploration was enormous. And then I think very much so, and everybody talks about this, the importance of diversity within the team. And not just cultural diversity, but thought processes. Nick and I were certainly opposites. I'm very practical and get the execution done and let's get on it. And he was much more creative thinker and got us into that space. And then when you bring that together with great project geologists like yourself, and then management that's willing to fund you, like a great service provider that we had a 20-year relationship with drilling. All of that is what makes a great team. What's the saying? Where's the best place to find elephants? It's elephant country.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
I think, with structurally hosted gold deposits, it's a lot easier to find more structurally hosted gold deposits in the same area. Not quite the same maybe with a porphyry. So I think, knowing your deposit style, knowing your camp, all of those things I left with you.
How about what lessons of what not to do have you taken away from that?
No, there's not. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything that.
Well, maybe let's ask the question a little bit differently. What aspects have you seen in like subsequent groups that
Oh, okay.
like that maybe like I don't want to say were mistakes, right? But they were things maybe they didn't focus on, or they could have done better in that sense. Like what part of that kind of environment
Oh,
did you find
okay, we'll
in? And
keep
you
it
don't have to like
really
slam
general.
like you like companies later, but it's
Definitely
like
not. No, I'll
like
keep it
Yeah.
super, super general. I think that there are groups that just don't drill enough. They get stuck in the desktop and you can just go around in circles forever and ever and never get boots on the ground and not drill. Of course, there is a happy medium and you need to do all of that background work. Of course, the greenfields, remote exploration is totally different to exploration at St. Ives. But I think that there are similarities. And at some point, you need to take the plunge. And whether that plunge is just getting boots on the ground, doing mapping, doing some geophysical surveys, collecting samples, doesn't need to be 20 diamond holes. But I think that time between the desktop and action, I've seen it be really long or just non-existent. And then as I was talking about before, definitely just not enough drilling. So that, in Canada, this wasn't the case in Australia, but in Canada, we have a very limited field season in the north. And
yeah.
so if you don't drill as much as you should, you have to wait another year to get back up there. So I think keeping that in mind and taking that risk, easy for me to say when it's not my, not having to shell out the cash. But yeah, I think it's really protracted the time that it takes to go from a concept to an initial drill target to something more, either kill it or progress it. So I feel like, we need to get better at that.
You say somewhat jokingly that it's not your money, but I think it's an important point because I think this is what you got to advocate for, right? That at some point you got to go collect data. Like, the surefire way of finding nothing is doing nothing. So, like at some point, like you got to accept that, yeah, there's going to be a high degree of failure in whatever money you will spend. But you got to advocate some level of it. And that's kind of like, the point I was making before is that, like the fact that you were at a point where you did diamond drilling, like it was probably the most appropriate data you could have collected at that time because it unraveled a certain, like I'm not sure, right, but I'm like kind of filling the blanks, but I can assume that if you're drilling on a salt lake, if you just kept drilling air core and tried to piece together like the level of geology you had and what was happening, it would be infinitely harder than if you
Oh,
had
yeah.
drilled like diamond, right? Because you had structural data all of a sudden, you had like much better visual data, like the fact that it was a lot better constrained, you got a lot more out of it. Also considering the fact that air core samples are usually terrible. So, like what can you actually get out of them? So I
Yeah.
think, like that's, I think something you got to sometimes advocate for that. Yeah, I know it's expensive and it does all of these things, but if you really want to improve the uncertainty that you face, like you have to collect the appropriate level of data to kind of get there.
And I think the other, like one of the real big lessons I learned too is how important data quality is, right? Like, so like I know, Ayesha, you were logging core from this, and I forgot who else was logging core on this. Was it John Doerr or, but I
I
can't
think there
remember.
was a group. There were a few of us.
Yeah. And it was great quality core, like for oriented core. And that was fairly early days of oriented core, right? It was great quality. And I think that's what enabled that demonstration of continuity that ultimately convinced the resource modeler that it was actual continuity and not just like making shapes up to connect gold.
Yeah.
And so I was really struck for the rest of my career on just how much you can get from high quality data that's been carefully collected with an intention of creating a resource estimate for an ore deposit. And it's really stuck with me since then.
And the importance too, like of using available technology. So Leapfrog wasn't what it is now. I wouldn't say it was just coming out, but it wasn't being used for resource estimation with a lot of big companies, but we were using it for geological modeling. And we were really able to quickly update our models, right? So we were able to, with
Yeah.
every single intercept, update the black flag kind of mesh that we had and look at the structural discs and understand what kind of continuity we were seeing with all of those measurements. So really taking advantage of that, not just the data, but then using that data somewhat real time was really important to that kind of quick progress.
I mean, what did you say? A year to go from like discovery to a resource? Like, I mean, that's unheard of now. Like most people don't even get out of the desktop study stage until that. Like, that's
But
impressive.
again, that is St. Ives, right? Like you would never do that if you had Invincible
Yeah.
in the Yukon, there's no way that would have happened. So I think one of my colleagues, he just deflated my ego in such a big way when he's like, Ayesha, finding a deposit in the gold fields is like shooting fish in a barrel. Come on. But it's in the sense that it's not the same, as some the Yukon. Yeah.
Like the history of St. Ives is interesting, right? That it's this massively prospective area, and for people that don't know, like St. Ives before it was Goldfields was WMC, right? And then WMC had all these ideas about what was kind of happening under the lake, but they somewhat blew their brains out trying to drill at that time. So it was like people kind of always wanted to do it, but for a while, technology had to kind of catch up to allow them to drill through the lake in a certain way. Like you can go look at like WMC like peppered the hell out of the edge of the lake, but but they could never really go on the lake proper because it just wasn't possible. And so then like the whole like you could build like a causeway out, and then the way you built a drill pad on the lake, and then how you actually drilled through that and got through like the salty water, all of that had to kind of develop for people to then be able to go and like you talked about like the permissive volume, right? Like there was this like permissive volume sitting there. It's just that the technology had to catch up to allow people to kind of drill it.
And
Definitely.
it was really a confluence of a lot of things, right? Because you think about at the time, geos were really hard to get, right? That's why I got a job there, is because they couldn't find an Aussie. So I
They
had
couldn't
to
find
come and
anyone else.
relearn how to.
Bottom of the barrel, Scott.
Yeah, no, that was it. They're like, oh, well, I guess we'll take a risk here,
No, but like it's funny you say that as a joking point, Scott, but like you like realistically go back and talk to the guys that used to work on salt lakes. Like a lot of people like didn't work on salt lakes on purpose because of how like how shit a time it was to work previously, right? Like it was it was bad. Like you're just like kind of like slogging away on these programs, which were more and more difficult to kind of execute. So so you like funnily you say like your ignorance about the issue of working in on salt lakes on Lake Lefroy was probably something that I don't know if Goldfields actively targeted it, but it probably was something that they looked at, right?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I remember when I was looking for someone to run this program, like I always like to do volunteers, and then I like to volunteer if I don't get any volunteers. And so, we'd gone through and like asked for volunteers. And I remember Ayesha came in at the end of the day, and I think she fell face first into the mud, and because she was like coated head to toe in salt and mud. And she's like, I heard you need a volunteer. And I was like, good Lord, what's happened to you? But it was interesting, right? Because it's like, I think it took a lot of grit and determination from all of these people. You think about the drillers going out there every single day when there was a meter of water and they're trying to slog through that. I mean, there's people like you overtop your boots in salt water, and it's like, and I remember like even just some of the geos, the absolute brutality of the conditions, right? Where it's like, as Ayesha was saying, sunburn on the bottom of your nose. Like, who's heard of that? So, and I go back to like the hiring managers at that site. I think they did a great job. I think that was one of the most diverse teams I've ever worked with. It was incredible to work there. Like I remember like I met people from all over the world, and it was like all those people came together, not just to make this project happen, because this was like one of the success stories, but they did all of these other projects, right? And I think about, that's hard. That is really hard to hire a group of people that can work so well together with such different perceptions of the world. And it was awesome. Like I just had such a good time with the people on that team. And ultimately, it wasn't just the geology team. It wasn't just Project Gen. It was environmental and permitting and survey and all these other people.
Yeah.
Like they went to bat, like it was one of the best team efforts I have ever seen in my career. And I think that was what made it just so much fun to come in on, to work, It's just like, what are we going to see today?
Yeah, definitely.
And also, I think I think it was good you mentioned kind of the support of like other, like obviously lake, like it's a sensitive environmental area. You needed kind of like, those guys to help you get through that process as well. Like developing something under the lake is not necessarily an easy task either. So again, like, that's another place that it could have been kiboshed or could have been stuck in like development hell for 3 or 4 years or something like that. So like you kind of needed those guys to help you push things along as well.
Yep.
And Ayesha, your comment, like like the question I was asking about, like what are groups that like that may not have had the same kind of DNA as what Goldfields did at the time. Like often I think one of the things that people kind of struggle with is that non-technical part, like how do we get through permitting and how do we, how do we find appropriate drilling contractors or
Mm-hmm.
things like that? Like all of those things can kind of grind a project down as well for months or years.
And I think that was one of the areas that like I think Julian did really, really well on is, rounding up all the appropriate people and getting them on the same page so that they all helped out. Because it'd be really easy to be like, wait. There's not even an inferred resource on this, and you want us to do what? And so I
Yeah.
can't imagine those conversations were easy.
Yeah, but that's also the benefit of you guys being in St. Ives at that time, right? Like all of that support already kind of sat there. So it's that, like a lot of these widgets kind of have to be there or to be put into place really, really quickly. And I think the role that management really plays is they either build those widgets really quickly or they find them really quickly. Like, so, like you guys don't, the technical team doesn't get ground down with the fact that now all of these non-technical issues are going to kibosh whatever they're doing. You were part of this discovery when you were probably not at the top of the pyramid. So your perspective is completely different to someone that, like would have been at the top of the pyramid. They might have had an easier time or maybe a harder time. Like I think,
For sure.
like one of the things that, like Scott and I talked about was that, like discoveries, I feel are more like a movie, right? Like, people come in, people go out, people have different parts at different parts of the movie. And so, like you never really, like one scene may not have any relevance to the next one until like an hour later, then you kind of figure out that actually, they have quite a lot of relevance to each other. And so, that's how I kind of feel like these stories often kind of work out. And like, at your perspective, I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to other people in the team at that time. Like, their
Totally.
perspectives might have been like completely different. They might have had a much higher level of frustration dealing with upper management than you
Yeah.
guys did, right? So like, you don't know. It's a fair kind of comment in that, I think. I often feel like in the moment, because of the way I think maybe recognition gets handed out, I think people feel like you're either the it crowd or outside the it
Yeah.
crowd. And
Yeah.
but I think in hindsight, when you go back and kind of talk to people, people often realize that it wasn't. Yeah, like it wasn't like a purposeful thing. It was just that, there had to be one person that had to drive things and one person that had, you had to be a team leader or team member, that kind of aspect.
Yeah.
And so that, that's not the recognition of like pure success or not success in that sense.
For sure.
I felt really terrible after I did the interview on Exploration Radio. One of my peers reached out and was like, "Dude, it totally sounds like you took credit for that entire thing." And I was like, "Oh, that's awful." Like I really didn't want to do that. And so like, I still feel bad about it. So like, hence I'm making a podcast to, correct the record. But
Nice. Okay. Yes.
it's tough, right? Because like what I realized from that is, and it's kind of what I started with earlier, but it's like my perspective is one small part of that film reel, right? And sometimes that's all people ever hear. And so what I really want is to get more of that film reel playing so that like people can actually hear this and realize that it's not Ayesha taking credit for this. It's not me taking credit for this or Julian or anybody else. Because I don't think any of us individually, like I think Nick would have found this ore deposit. So I do credit him with the discovery of it. And I can't, I don't mean to take that away at all. But I go back to like, it could have just as easily been canned down the road, right? And so it's everybody's success. Like ultimately it wouldn't have happened if all of these people hadn't done what they did. But it's really tough. It's a really tough thing to how do you separate success as a team out unless you can talk to all the people involved, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, thank you for joining our first interview. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. And if you did, please join us for the next one.
Digging deep where the stories hide, through the hills hills and the mountains wide. Pickaxe swing and the earth unfolds, chasing dreams in the dirt and gold. Geology calling under our feet, secrets are buried in the rock and heat. With a heart full of wonder and a map in hand, exploring the treasures of this great land.